everyone. I'm Emily Canfield. I'm with Huntsville Environmental Coalition. If you have not heard of us, we are a coalition of different environmental concerned organizations, nonprofits mostly. We are starting to invite businesses. We have an initiative called the EAT program, where we're trying to reduce single-use plastics and create more sustainable ways of making and producing our foods without any pollution. And we also have green things that we have every last Wednesday of every month at Yellowhammer. It's a meetup, a social club meetup, where we can just hang out and you learn about something that might be environmental or sustainability minded. We are going to be inviting some experts on AI data centers. I'm sorry, if we can invite you, that'd be great, to our Green Thinks. But it's very informal, casual, less than 15 minutes of someone speaking, and then we hang out and drink or eat or hang out and have a great time. So I really am proud to see everyone here from Huntsville. Thank you so much. Pat on the back for standing up for the future. I appreciate you. So go to our website, HuntsvilleEnvironmentalCoalition.org, and we have a calendar of all the different sustainability, environmental, anything that has to do with our coalitions on one calendar. So thank you so much.
I do want to say briefly that we are a 501c4. We are interested in everything from affordable housing to criminal justice reform to the environment to education to helping candidates getting elected. So if you want to get more involved with us, we would love to have you as an active member. Our membership dues are $20 a year. It's not going to break the bank, but we need your expertise and we would love to have you as a member. Right now, I'm going to introduce our Vice President, Sue Seward, and she's going to tell you about something special that's going to happen tonight.
Besides, Charles. One of our members, founding members, Carol LaTorre Elliott, could not be with us tonight, but she did some research for us, and that was very helpful. And she has donated a small door prize for this evening. So the yellow tablet that you may or may not have signed in on is going to be circulating down the rows. If you've already signed it, that's great. Don't sign it again. But if you have not signed it, put your name and just put your name by a number, and if you run out of numbers, add another number to it. We're going to draw one before the evening is over for that. I wanted to tell you briefly about the next two meetings that we're going to have. In September, we're going to have a program that's going to be titled, Why the Alabama Supreme Court is Important to You. And we're going to have an expert on that. She happens to be a candidate for the Alabama Supreme Court, so she's done her homework. She's been a practicing attorney for a long time and a very, very good speaker. So I hope you'll watch for that advertisement on the EWC Facebook page. And then in October, another very important topic that most people don't know anything about, and that is the Alabama State School Board. And we happen to have one of the candidates running for that. Actually, they're both from this area, but one of them will be at the meeting that night. So I hope that you'll think about coming to the next two meetings. They're generally on the first Monday, but sometimes if they're not, because we can't get the room or because it falls on holiday. So that's my two announcements for the evening. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Charles Miller from the Alabama Rivers Alliance, an incredible organization that is so concerned about water in Alabama. If you want, you can look them up on the internet and join them. They are a great organization. Charles Miller, let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Yeah, and I heard some people talking about whether they're C4s or C3s. Alabama Rivers Alliance is a statewide 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to building partnerships, empowering communities, and my job advocating for sound water policy and its enforcement in Alabama. So that's what we do. This is actually going to be a longer version of a talk I gave at Green Things a couple months ago, or if you like, a shorter version of a presentation I've given a lot of times. So this is about data centers in general, and I always like to, when I can, when people let me, I want to make my own presentations, kind of set the stage with a quote. And this is from a 13th century Catholic German theologian, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. But the quote is, "When the truth is known, then the merchants must be gone, for truth wants no merchandising." And there's kind of an emerging theme that you will probably catch on to throughout this, that a lot of what we are going to be talking about and a lot of what is on social media, in the news, etc., when it comes to both data centers and the technology that's underlying this data center boom, AI, or machine learning, if we want to be real, there's a lot of hype surrounding it. And a lot of what you see in the media and on social media is just that, hype or merchandising, as Meister Eckhart would have. Okay, so super basic. I have a law degree. We like to start with definitions, so let's start with a very basic definition of what is a data center. It's a dedicated space within a building or a group of buildings used to house computer systems and associated components like telecommunications and storage systems. So that could be anything from literally like a server closet in your office building to, as we had in Bessemer, a proposal for something the size of 18 Walmart supercenters. So it's a very broad category, right? And that's one of the things that I think gets lost a lot of times in the online discussion and in the media discussion is there's not a one-size-fits-all data center solution when it comes to regulation, when it comes to even just describing them, right? This is a picture of what for a little while was the only data center in Birmingham, Alabama. It's called DC Blocks, and you can probably get a sense there that it's not like super huge, right? It's maybe the size of like, probably about this library, maybe like a small high school. And it's not, taking up hundreds of acres. It's sitting on a, former industrial site. It's pretty unobtrusive, both in terms of its size and appearance, and from what I've heard from people in the community in terms of its impact on their lives. Here's a little bit fancier definition that Birmingham recently adopted that basically says the same thing, and then adds in a little part at the end talking about some of the other kind of technical things that might be associated with a larger scale data center, like air handlers, water cooling, storage, utility substations, etc. So where are data centers? And you know what? I cannot tell you the last time I updated this. It's been a little over a month, so there might be more. But this is a pretty good kind of general overview of where there are data centers in the Southeast. So you can see there's a big, big cluster, as I walk in front of the projector here, around Atlanta, Georgia. There's also one around Charlotte, and there's kind of these emerging hubs, one around Memphis, which is home to maybe the most famous data center in the country, which we'll probably mention later. There's a couple in Birmingham, there's a handful in Huntsville, and so you generally kind of see these things associated with, other kinds of economic activity, right? Atlanta's a big hub for all kinds of stuff, right? It's like the major city in the Southeast. Charlotte's a big financial hub, and, people who are dealing with money want to be able to crunch numbers, and they want to be able to do it fast. And one of the things that I also want to emphasize about data centers in this, and I think people are starting to catch on to this, the internet is not just like off somewhere. It's not like immaterial. It is a real thing. It's wires and servers and buildings like the one we saw on the second slide. So companies that are buying space in data centers, whether that's for processing or storage, want low latency. They want to be able to get the information really quickly. And they care about like microseconds. So they want data centers as close to wherever they're going to be using the data as possible. I like to walk around anyway, so bear with me. Anyway, so here's our first example of a marketing term, hyperscale data center. So here's a definition from IBM, but there's no real set definition. It's basically just a really, really big data center. And again, that kind of varies by how it's regulated. So, for example, when I started doing this work about 1.5 years ago, generally the rule of thumb, as I understood it, was over 100 megawatts was a hyperscaler. For reference, that DC Blocks data center in Birmingham that I showed you is a 5 megawatt data center. 100 megawatts is a tenth of a gigawatt. A gigawatt serves about, in Alabama, 750,000 homes worth of electricity, just to kind of have a reference, because I know megawatt doesn't mean anything to me either. Not an electricity guy. But we're starting to see what was once a marketing term, hyperscale, get incorporated into regulations, and it's usually going to be based on a megawatt usage number, just because that's kind of, I'm a water expert, that's what I do, but I do tend to agree that our biggest kind of top line in terms of resource impacts is probably going to be electricity. So another word about how we kind of lose a little bit of nuance when we let everything get collapsed into just the term data centers, right? So that DC Blocks data center I showed you, that was built before 2019. It was built before anybody had heard of ChatGPT or Claude or XAI, and it was built mostly to store information. And a lot of people still seem to think that that's what all data centers are, but they're not. The hyperscalers that are driving the build out that I think have captured a lot of people's attention are generally going to be built to support AI. So they're going to have different hardware inside than an old-fashioned data center like the DC Blocks one. They're also going to be more energy intensive and run hotter because they're running all of the time to train these models. Another thing that I just want to touch on, and again, the theme is coming, right? There's a lot of different things that are marketed as AI, right? Okay, like I was telling my coworkers something and we use Slack to communicate, if y'all are familiar with Slack. And Slack has started marketing itself as like an AI-first communication tool. And I've never used AI in Slack. Like I don't even know where AI in Slack is. So AI itself has kind of become this buzzword that covers a broad swath of kind of processes that are getting lumped into, again, this buzzword AI, which stands for artificial intelligence, which, some of these processes certainly are not, and I would argue almost all of them are not artificially intelligent. Emphasis on the intelligent. And I actually have a really good example here. This hits a little closer to home in Birmingham, but I bet some of y'all are familiar with the Cahaba River in central Alabama. It's the longest free-flowing river in the state. It's undammed. It's an incredibly, beautiful natural jewel of central Alabama and our whole state. And it's really famous for water lilies. And they just finished blooming. And I got this off Facebook. I didn't have a source on it because it's AI, so I didn't feel a need to, source it. But anyway, this purports to be an image of the Cahaba River. Does anybody know what's wrong with this picture?
Those are water lilies.
Those are water lilies. The Cahaba lilies don't look like that.
No, they don't.
They look like this. And to get a little serious and zoom out for a second, that to me, and this is an ongoing problem, it is part of the problem with a lot of large language models and image generation, is that they're kind of like finding the average. They're finding the lowest common denominator. And not everything's like that. Certainly not everything in the natural world is average, right? And I think, the fact that these shoal spider lilies grow in like 5 places on Earth, and they look different than lily pads, and they're incredibly rare. Many of the shoals where they would have grown were drowned by dams in the early 20th century. I think these are a lot more special and a lot more meaningful and worth seeing in person, or at least seeing a real picture, versus just kind of your nice little AI generated image there. So I think everybody's kind of caught on to this actually. I drafted this presentation about a year and a half ago for the Alabama Water Resources Conference, and I think at that time it was kind of less known about water use and AI and data centers. But just kind of a brief rundown of how they use water. You know, we talked about these are buildings that are full of computing and hardware, right? If you've ever sat with your laptop on your lap for like more than 30 minutes, it gets hot, right? Well, imagine 18 Walmart supercenters full of your laptops. It's gonna get really hot. And then just a couple of other things to kind of highlight, and you know, we'll talk about how I interpret these in a minute, but in relative terms, decreasing water use increases electricity use. And in terms of both energy costs and dollars and cents, water cooling is actually generally going to be cheaper than AC. So almost every data center you see is going to have some form of water or liquid cooling. The thing to remember in Alabama is that our electricity use often also uses water. The largest consumer of water in our state is electricity generation, because we have coal plants, we have gas plants, and we have nuclear plants that basically burn those fuels, or in the case of a nuclear plant, you know, split the atom to drive a steam turbine, which needs water to create steam. And so our electricity use in Alabama also consumes water. So there is a trade-off, but in states like Alabama where you don't have a lot of renewables, where you don't have a lot of solar and wind, you're still using water kind of just a step removed. The other thing I'd like to say is that when it comes to those trade-offs, you know, and water being more thermally efficient at cooling than just pure air conditioning, you know, these are really not just questions of physics, these are questions that we have to decide politically, right? I think I've seen a lot of really good polling that kind of indicates people are more supportive of data centers that bring their own power and bring their own renewable energy, right? And so that's one way you can reduce water use while not kind of dealing with the trade-off between, well, I'm using less water, but I'm being less efficient and I'm using fossil fuels to generate the electricity, because that's not ideal either. This is kind of a really brief overview of something that I think, again, people have gotten a lot more familiar with, and the industry's gotten good, again, at marketing. There's kind of two different systems that they use, generally speaking. There's about like at least 20 different closed loop systems that I'm aware of, designs. So there's a lot of nuance there that I am certainly not the person to get into because I'm not an engineer. But in general, there's kind of two ways that this cooling works. One is an open system, which is pretty much what it sounds like. You suck water out of the environment, you run it through some pipes, it picks up heat, some of it turns into steam and evaporates, the rest goes back into your river, lake, whatever, a little bit warmer usually, which can have some impacts on aquatic life. And the reason that that used to be used a lot is it's cheaper, right? You just basically have a pipe and pump. Closed systems are something that the industry is really touting right now, and I think the way they're doing it is a little bit dishonest. I've seen a lot of claims of zero water use systems, and I have not seen anything that really stands up to my burden of proof. And the reason for that is, right, we're using the water to absorb heat. You can't just absorb heat indefinitely, right? It overheats, it boils off. In the case of open systems, turns into steam. So what they have in a closed loop system is you actually have two loops. You've got your closed loop, and you've got a heat exchanger with another loop that's an open loop. They use less water. That is good. I'm not trying to take away from that. I'm just saying that I think a lot of the marketing I've seen says, oh, we charge it once and it's done, or it uses no water at all. And again, I've just not seen anything that stands up to the level of proof I'd like to see on that. There are also non-water-based alternatives. Ethylene glycol, which you probably know as antifreeze in your car, is another one. And of course, some of those come with their own environmental risks if they were to escape the cooling system. So, I'm not going to get into all of this, but I do just want to point out that we do also need to consider that, as I mentioned, that embodied usage in power generation, that kind of upstream use of water that we use to generate electricity. That's also going into this, and again, certainly not an expert in this, but there's also a lot of really, really pure water used in the chip manufacturing process as well. There's some metrics there the industry's come up with to measure those. I actually think this is a really good question to ask any developer, right? Is just, what's your water usage efficiency? You don't have to know what it means, but, I'm being a little bit flippant, but you don't need to know what it means, but they do, right? Like, they're the ones building it. They should have at least a kind of back of the napkin estimate of how much power it's going to use, what the system's going to look like that cools it, and then it's pretty easy to, if you have those two numbers, you just divide them. And that's one thing that I've seen a lot of in Alabama and elsewhere in the country is a lot of the people that are proposing these facilities, they're not Meta, they're not Google, they're not Amazon, they're not Microsoft, they're third-party developers who are property developers. They're not data center builders. They are there to flip a 1,000-acre piece of property, make a really, really nice amount of money for not doing that much. And the issue with that is if that's the person that's up front, that's talking to your city council, that's talking to your county commission, they don't know anything about how the thing's going to be built unless they have a customer in mind. And if they have a customer in mind, they should tell you who it is. And if they have a customer in mind, they can actually probably give you something reasonably close to an estimate for water use efficiency. And we have seen at least a couple data centers in Alabama that were built by kind of the tech company itself, whoever was going to operate it, and they had some pretty good numbers like this up front, just saying like, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to build it. And to me, that builds a lot more trust with the community, and it also means you've got something you can hang your hat on, right? You've got something you can say, whoa, whoa, whoa. These guys said it was going to be closed loop, they're building it open loop, etc. The third-party developers, you say they said they were going to build a closed loop. Now, the guys that bought it from are building an open loop. The guys that bought it from are just like, I didn't say that. So it gives you something you can actually kind of hold somebody to, which I think is very useful. These are kind of self-explanatory, but there's certain factors that influence on-site water usage, design and size being kind of the big ones, right? Your open loop systems, I'll give you an example. You guys are actually pretty close to it. Let me see, it might be on the next slide. Yes, okay. Bridgeport, Jackson County, right? Google just announced they're expanding this data center. This was, last time I checked, the only numbers we had on water consumption of a data center in Alabama. And I'm gonna give the caveat that Google's Jackson County data center is pretty big. It's pretty old. And I'm pretty sure based on these numbers, it was designed with an open loop system because it consumes about 90% of the water it withdraws. And when I say consumes, water is a cycle, it doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't disappear. But when I say consumed, I mean either evaporates or is lost through what they call blowdown, where it goes to a sewage treatment plant once they've kind of cleaned out the system. So just for comparison's sake, I talked about the largest consumer of water in our state right now is electric generation. When it comes to power plants that are coal-fired, gas-fired, nuclear-fired, you're looking at somewhere between, again, depends on the design, just like with a data center, but you're looking at somewhere between like 1 and like 25% of the water is consumed. So honestly, when I saw this number, it kind of made my eyes bug out, but that is straight from Google's own 2025 environmental report. So that covers water use in the previous year, 2024. This is another one I think people are asking a lot about, is kind of where are these proposed? And this is a not at all exhaustive list of data centers proposed in the state. I think the one that really got a lot of people's attention and got us started working on data centers was so-called Project Marvel in Bessemer. We actually recently got a hold of a non-disclosure agreement that the city signed with the property developer out of Atlanta that required them to destroy all confidential communications between the developer and the city. I don't know if y'all know, but we have an open records law that says you have to reserve and keep all public records, so I don't quite know how to square that circle. In any event, there's also some other ones. Like he said, Montgomery, Facebook is building a couple of data centers there. Something that I want to also point out, it's hard to get a lot of information about these. Like I said, Jackson County was the only one where we had good water use numbers. Montgomery is the only one where we have good kind of return on investment numbers. So the Alabama Department of Commerce puts out information about projects that receive financial incentives, usually tax breaks. And when you look at most industrial development across the state, you're looking at a greater than 100% return on investment just for the tax breaks, right? You run the numbers, and this is from our own Department of Commerce. Over 20 years, the two meta facilities in Montgomery will return, I think, on average 22%. So that's far below most other incentive-financed economic development projects in the state. It's also like below the stock market. Just like stick your money there. We've got a handful of others. The Birmingham Nebius Data Center has gotten a lot of attention. That DC Blocks Data Center I showed you on the second slide is getting ready to expand into a hyperscale data center. Shelby County is another interesting case. That was in the city of Columbiana. And Columbiana's mayor also signed a non-disclosure agreement. That information came out in September of last year, I believe. Their mayor at the time was up for election in November. He'd been mayor for a while. He was an incumbent, and he lost by 60 percentage points. So people don't like it when you sign a non-disclosure agreement, apparently. At least the people of Columbiana didn't. We've got a couple of others. This Lowndes County one is another big one. It's being brought to the state by a developer, third-party developer that has a lot of ties with big tech. A lot of the kind of C-suite leadership guys there came from Microsoft, places like that. But again, they don't have an end user. And in Lowndes County, some of y'all may be familiar, there's a really big issue with wastewater, right? They don't have centralized wastewater because it's a very rural county, and you also can't have, sewage treatment on site. It's very difficult there. And so we're trying to figure out how they're going to treat their wastewater when that, if that development gets completed. There's a handful of other ones some of y'all may have heard of. That Morgan County one is actually a crypto mine, which I don't really understand the economics of anymore, but Morgan County passed a resolution issuing a moratorium against crypto mining and I believe data centers in the county. So, what are some solutions? I will give credit where credit is due and say that there are industry groups and companies that are working to improve water efficiency. Some of the bigger tech companies that I've mentioned have what they call water positive or water neutral goals that basically are commitments to restore or pay for restoration of the same amount of water that they consume through their data centers. And again, there's another kind of trend here. You tend to see, again, like the big tech companies, and there's some variation among them, and I'm not saying they're all great, but they tend to have stuff, again, you can hang your hat on, right? You can say, hey, Microsoft, you came here and built this. You said you're gonna be water positive. So like, what are you doing in our community? And I think that's really important too, because water is a really local issue. And I think that gets lost sometimes. So, if Microsoft has this pledge, I want to see them fulfill that pledge in Alabama, not, in Georgia for a data center in Alabama or in Mississippi for a data center in Tennessee. So companies have those goals. The number one thing, and y'all are doing a great job of this right now, is organize. Get involved with existing groups. Meet your neighbors, because this stuff comes really, really fast, and there's not a lot of time to fight it, usually. It's usually, your main point of leverage is gonna be like a zoning decision. And so get to know your neighbors first, and that way, when you hear about something, or when they hear about something and bring it to you, you're not strangers, and you already have a rapport, and you can build off of that to achieve something. So that's kind of where we are there. I've got a couple of resources there, and I'll just leave up my information there. I actually came straight from Virginia today, so I don't have my cards on me. But my email's there. If you've got questions for me, feel free to email me there. And those are our websites. We actually had a film last year for our Southern Exposure Film Fellowship series about the Bessemer project. It's called Hyperscaled, so if you go to southernexposurefilms.org, you can see that. And I do just want to close out with something that I think a lot of people don't know, and it's why data center water use, even if it's not huge in terms of absolute numbers, is really important in Alabama and some other states that are like us. We do not have rules on how much water you can withdraw, period. There is no permitting for water withdrawals in the state of Alabama. If you're harmed by a water withdrawal, the only recourse you have is to go sue somebody in court, which is a lengthy process, costs a lot of money, and oftentimes by the time that's resolved, the issue itself is resolved, because a lot of these are driven by drought and things of that nature. So that's really why we got involved in data center work, and that is really, really important. Again, here, Louisiana, and that's really the issue, because Bessemer's going to use somewhere between 2 and 10 million gallons a day if they complete it. That sounds like a lot. It's honestly not that much for a large area. But the issue, and we've seen this actually happen in Georgia, and we've seen it happen in Virginia in a kind of different way, is you can have localized shortages. You can have localized issues with having the infrastructure necessary to supply the water and to treat the water. And unless there are really, 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 really firm binding commitments from these companies, I don't believe that we will always have the ability to upgrade that infrastructure, both on the front end, the kind of source water end, and on the back end. And so, unless there's somewhere where somebody has oversight and can say, hey, whoa, we got 5 of these in this area, they're all using 10 million gallons a day, you're now using as much as like a medium to large size city. That's too much. You guys gotta go somewhere else. That's what we need. We need somebody who can kind of step in and make sure that water is being apportioned equitably. And then, the highest and best uses, things like agriculture, drinking water, productive industry, and of course, the environment. Those take priority over things that are, in my opinion, kind of luxury uses of water, like data centers. So, happy to take any questions for about 15 minutes. I've actually got an engagement in Birmingham a little bit later. But yeah, happy to take any questions for a little while.
Yes, can you address our Meta Center right here in Huntsville, Alabama? This is on a campus of 340 acres. They have been up and running since 2018. If you read their literature, they're doing all of the right things. They have a closed system. I feel like the public has been totally left out of this process. So do you know anything about this Facebook?
So I don't really know anything about that data center in particular, but what I will say, I had a chance earlier to look at Huntsville's zoning ordinances. So I mentioned we don't have any state regulation of water use. And when it comes to any kind of land use, really your go-to is going to be your local zoning ordinance. And you saw an excerpt earlier from Birmingham's ordinance that they adopted this year. Most cities in the state have not adopted zoning ordinances and requirements for data centers. They just haven't. It's a very new industry. It's booming. It's coming super fast, and it takes time to write an ordinance. So Birmingham did something smart. They adopted a moratorium. They said, we're not going to take any new applications while we figure this out, while we write their ordinance. And I want to give their planning and zoning staff a lot of credit because they did a really good job with their ordinance. Huntsville does not have any regulations on data centers, so the question I would have would probably be directed towards planning and zoning staff, which would be, okay, so data centers is not, singled out as a use. What kind of umbrella was this under? Because Birmingham was in the same boat with DC Blocks. I think that property is zoned mixed use medium, and they just basically said well, this is similar enough because of kind of the footprint, what it does, how it works inside, that we're gonna kind of lump it in with this other stuff, because most zoning ordinances have kind of this catch-all at the end, and they just say or similar uses that don't, cause a nuisance or something like that. I think for smaller data centers, it's probably okay, right? Because they're not having huge offsite impacts. But when we start to get into, multiple hundreds of acres, tens of megawatts, then you probably are having some offsite impacts, whether those are direct, like noise or particulate pollution, or whether they're just indirect in terms of cost for infrastructure, both electrical and water. So, I would really urge people to kind of ask some questions about how, in the absence of specific regulations for data centers, how the city is addressing this. And I would, I encourage anybody, I've talked with the Fort Payne City Council about data center zoning ordinances. And I think, just like with the data centers themselves, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think every city needs to have at least something in their pocket so that if a project that they don't like comes, they have something where they can say, well, hey, you gotta do all of this, or we only allow it here, or it can't be bigger than this. So that's something I would, again, encourage every city to do. The fact that Huntsville doesn't have specific language about data centers in its zoning ordinance for a city of its size, is something I would hope to see change.
Hey, I have a question on potential hurdles or obstacles when it comes to such localized solutions for this, because obviously water is not stagnant. Well, hopefully it's not stagnant, it's moving and it impacts a lot of areas. So if something happens upstream, it's gonna have impacts downstream. And while we can change things that are happening in Madison County, I don't impact what Lauderdale County does with the same body of water, or a county just across the state line in Tennessee where they don't have to listen to me at all. I don't live there, I don't pay taxes there. So what would you say are some things to think about to get around maybe some of those obstacles where it's a regional effort maybe, and not necessarily just county by county, and hoping that these counties don't have a race to the bottom to try to attract new companies?
Right. And yeah, that's very perceptive, because that's exactly what we saw in Bessemer. They did kind of an interesting thing where they were able to offload. It wasn't in their water utility service area, and it wasn't in their electric utility service area. So basically all of the costs were borne by people outside of the city limits. And don't laugh when I say this, but in that case, kind of the best case scenario is you kind of depend on the goodwill and the good faith of your neighboring communities. Now, what I will say is, if we have statewide solutions to this, then that becomes less of an issue, right? You still have the issue of Tennessee or Georgia or Mississippi or whatever, but if we have some statewide regulations in place that are meaningful, then you're not as concerned about Lauderdale County kind of cutting your legs out from under you by adopting some weak ordinances. I'll say this, that got harder because earlier this year, the Alabama legislature passed a bill called SB 71, that's now law, the governor signed it, that prohibits the Department of Environmental Management or any other state agency or department from adopting rules stricter than federal minimums unless they can prove direct causation to a manifest bodily harm in humans, which basically means you have to prove not only that you have cancer, but that you got it from like a particular molecule. The way I talked about it in the State House was, you have to prove which cigarette gave you cancer, because that's what direct causation requires in a legal sense. So ADEM doesn't have the ability now to adopt its own rules kind of as it would normally do, and so it's going to take an act of the legislature to do something about data center impacts at state level.
You didn't mention the power units that are required for the data centers. For a megawatt unit, that could be a pretty large new power support.
Yeah, and there's actually kind of two interesting angles. Again, I'm gonna tell y'all I'm not an expert on electricity. My father-in-law is, but I'm not. And so yeah, you're obviously having to build new generation potentially. Bessemer again, I hate to keep harping on it, but I know the most about that. It was a 1.2 gigawatt facility. Alabama Power recently purchased an entire new gas plant in central Alabama called Lindsay Hill. Lindsay Hill generates about 960 megawatts. It's about 300 megawatts short for a new gas plant to power one facility. The other thing is you have to have on-site backup. Sometimes that can be battery power, and that's really good because you can use renewables to charge that. You have it on site. If a breaker trips and the grid goes down, you can use the battery, and it's not putting off any emissions. But we've seen the tendency in the industry is, and sometimes not even for backup, they use this for just like regular everyday generation, like XAI in Memphis, is either gas turbines, which emit particulate emissions, and also methane, which is greenhouse gas that's many times more potent than CO2 when it comes to trapping heat in the atmosphere. Or they use diesel generators. Diesel, of course, being one of the dirtiest petroleum products, creates a lot of localized air pollution. And an issue with that is they have to test these things every month. And so you've got that. You're always going to be seeing these running at some point during the month. That can kind of trigger asthma attacks for sensitive populations. The other thing that I've seen that was really interesting, and again, I think cumulative impacts are a big thing here, and we're not, I think, in Alabama at a point where we're seeing any of those yet with our data centers that are on the ground, but it's something that has happened in other states. There was a study, and I can't remember who did it, but it was in Virginia, in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is, they call it Data Center Alley. It's like, there's like 400 data centers in that county alone. They've been there for like, 20 years in some cases, and a lot of them have diesel powered backups. And somebody just kind of put together a scenario and said, well, what if the grid was out for 48 hours because there was a hurricane or a tornado or some other large scale disruption? It would violate the annual air emissions limits in that 48 hours, like for the entire state of Virginia, just from the data center backup generators. So again, smart planning and thinking about the cumulative impacts of this is really, really, really important.
When you get a minute, we go back to slides so we can picture the references.
Yeah. Good evening, my name is Sheila McNeil, and I am running for the Public Service Commission, Place 2. And it is the Public Service Commission who will be reviewing the contracts for these data centers. They will also be responsible for managing the impact to the grid. So this is very important. I appreciate this information, and I think, and I need to hear your ideas about regional solutions, because the challenge for us with data centers in Alabama is we don't have a plan. It's all disjointed. The city council's doing this, and when the water gets polluted, then it's a state issue. Then it becomes a federal issue. It's disjointed. What do you think about the moratoriums, and if you think it'll have an impact, and what we should do, what you think, based on your information, what we should do?
I think the number one thing you should do is let your elected officials know that this is something you're concerned about. Because I'll tell you this, the best way to do it is, send them a letter, like an actual physical letter, or send them a personal email from your personal email address. And just let them know what your concerns are, because there's been a lot of discussion throughout the country that what I have witnessed as an incredible, cross-partisan grassroots movement that is just organically concerned about these things. A lot of people think that is not organic, and I don't know why, because this is honestly the most engagement on any issue I've ever seen that I've worked on. When I went to rent a car for this trip, and while I was waiting in line in Birmingham, somebody was talking about data centers. People aren't talking about water plant when I'm waiting in line at Hertz, right? So people are really concerned about this, and I think for whatever reason, and this is not exclusive to Alabama, it's not exclusive to one party, it's not exclusive to, local, state, any level of elected official. I think they just don't know that people are really fired up about this, and that they want real solutions. And it's not the kind of thing that people are gonna let go of, because they see the impact it's having on the economy, they see the potential impacts to the environment, to their jobs, to their well-being, to their kids' future, to their education, and they say, like, hey, we can't just let this be the Wild West. And I think that's true of all those things I just mentioned. I'm again gonna say I'm a water guy, that's all I really know about. But I think all of those things are legitimate concerns, and I think our elected officials and people running for office should hear about those. So, like I said, reach out to them and share your concerns with them in a way that lets them know you're a real person.
Do many states have NDAs for elected officials, or is Alabama unusual in that regard? That's question one. And question two was, does anybody know who is exactly responsible for the data center investment? Has it taken ownership?
Yeah, so second one, easy answer, data center company called QTS has purchased the property recently for about $500 million. And they're actually the ones that are behind a data center in Georgia that you may have heard is impacting people's well water. And I think it's Noonan, maybe. Bad with Georgia geography. Anyway. Like you, I was very surprised to find out that elected officials sign non-disclosure agreements. I've since found out that it is apparently very common practice in Alabama in economic development, and that a lot of elected officials kind of don't necessarily understand why people would be concerned about it. I think, again, I was surprised they could do it in the first place, so I share those kind of questions, and I think, again, when you see the content of some of these, where they say things like, you can't tell your constituents anything about this, and if we tell you to destroy anything that we've sent you, you have to. That is really, really where it gets concerning for me, right? Because these are public servants. They're not Mark Zuckerberg's servants. They're not, Bill Gates' servants. They are people elected to represent us, not a property developer from Georgia, and certainly not some Silicon Valley guys.
This question may or may not be related to data centers, but Huntsville Utilities just proposed a pilot project to install a 83,000-pound Tesla manufactured grid-scale battery in North Huntsville. The system, the purpose is to store off-peak power and reduce peak demand stress. Is this a good or bad project?
Without knowing all the details, I'm not going to commit to saying it's good or bad, but what I am going to say is, generally speaking, I like battery storage because it makes renewables more reliable. So, I think people overplay it a lot, but things like solar and wind do have some variability just based on, whether it is sunny outside or whether the wind is blowing, how fast the wind is blowing. We've done a really good job, I think, in terms of siting renewables and figuring out where they're gonna be the most efficient, I think we have a little ways to go sometimes in terms of siting them where they're gonna be the least disruptive. But all of that said, anything that we can do to make renewables more reliable is, in general, gonna be a good thing. Like I said, don't know the specifics of that project, its location, anything like that, but generally, I think I'm pretty supportive of things that allow us to store electricity for off-peak, because then it also kind of smooths out the demand curve and makes sure that like it doesn't get crazy expensive just because it got up to 90 degrees like it does every other day during the summer. All right, I think I've got time for just 2 more here, so I'll get these 2 guys in the back.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm special. My name is Thomas Cazzez. I'm running for Huntsville City Council, actually. And I did want to touch on this battery that you talked about specifically that's being built in North Huntsville. The primary purpose of the battery is actually to reduce the demand curve in the peak hours. So the way that we're getting most of our energy is from the TVA. And the TVA charges us based on, I think, an hour or 2-hour block of whenever we draw the most power as a city. And so the point of the battery is we store the power during the off hours, we discharge it during the peak hours. There's some concerns about the location. I'm not going to get into that because it's District 1 and Miss Councilwoman Watkins's job. I did have a question though. So you mentioned a question regarding the water usage that legislators should be asking whenever a developer comes down. I was wondering if you had any additional questions that councilwomen should be asking just to get a clear picture of what, because I know I've heard from the grapevines, we're getting some new data centers in North Alabama. I want to be ready whenever I get elected to make sure, hey, let's ask the right questions, so we don't have something really horrible go down in our community.
Kind of touched on this in the water stuff. I think the most important thing you can do is ask specific questions. Again, say like, how much, what's the water efficiency thing? And again, like that is just gonna make them go that extra step. A lot of these guys have caught on over the past year and a half that people are gonna ask questions about power usage, they're gonna ask about how it's gonna be cooled, they're gonna ask about buffers, but as much as you can, as specific as you can get that out of them, because that is always going to be, to me, indicative of a better developer and a better project, right? Because if they figured it out ahead of time, they're at least thinking ahead, which not all these guys are. I mean, I was kind of blown away by some of the presentations I've seen. I was like, dude, you get paid like 3 times as much as me. Like, you're really not, you're phoning it in here, buddy. Like, come on. Like, so the more specifics you can get, I think it makes a project, it makes it reveal how credible it actually is. And I think one of the things that I didn't touch on in the presentation that sometimes people are not aware of, and sometimes even local elected officials aren't aware of. Let's say, like Birmingham, you have data centers as an allowable use in your industrial 3 zone, your heavy industrial zone. And somebody comes to you and they say, I want to rezone this property to I3 for heavy industrial for a data center. You've also rezoned it for a bunch of other stuff that's not a data center. That could, especially in the context of heavy industrial, be a lot more polluting, be a lot more disruptive to a larger region. And so I think another thing I would encourage elected officials to kind of look at is, they call them reverters. Basically you say, okay, we're rezoning it for this purpose, for this data center, for these people. If you don't build it in 5 years, this goes back to the previous zoning. This goes back to a zoning that does not allow a heavy industrial use. So I think, getting creative and kind of making sure that the project you're promised is the project you get is really important.
My name is Ben Redfern. I'm running for the school board in District 3. One of the concerns I have as I've been looking into this is how tax incentives are used to attract these organizations to come to Alabama. As we may or may not know, a lot of the tax abatement data is not available project by project, which I've found to be really challenging to determine, is this even a net positive for the community? I understand there's education carved out in that, but the devil's in the details. How things are assessed certainly will drive what kind of revenue a school system, for instance, even with carved out, might receive. So just, in your experience, what is a normal tax incentive that might be offered to a company to come into a city?
I'm gonna cop out and say there's not a normal one, but I think a good point about the education tax carve out, that is very important, and I'm glad that exists. I'll say, to kind of piggyback off the last question, abatements in some cases, if you're a county, that's the only place you're gonna have any input because you can't zone for the most part. So you can attach some strings, and in some cases we've seen developers snub the incentives entirely because of that, I think, because you could attach conditions and you could say, okay, we'll give you 50% off your tax bill every year, your property tax bill, but you gotta use a closed loop system. And you gotta set this back, 1,000 feet from existing homes, and you gotta buy everybody in a 2-mile radius out, and you can do all kinds of stuff basically, because it's essentially a contract, it's not, legislation. But yeah, I think, like I mentioned, our only real info that we have in terms of the return on investment is that Meta one in Montgomery. And again, a bigger tech company, I think, is probably giving you a better return on investment than like somebody even like QTS or something. So that, again, it really is a cause for concern for me. And again, to talk about getting a little creative, the Birmingham Industrial Development Board did something with their incentives that I thought was interesting, where, again, they basically attached reverters. They said, I think it was 60% of their property and sales taxes are abated, but only if they actually follow through on their promises on jobs and things of that nature. So you can get creative, you can make sure that there's actually mechanisms to hold them accountable. And that to me is the biggest thing about all of this, is just putting something there that can give some folks some accountability, right? Because otherwise, you're gonna have some guy from Georgia waltz in, say, this is gonna be the best thing that's ever happened to your town, this is gonna be the best thing that's ever happened to your city. And I gotta say, if somebody came to me and said, hey, this is gonna be $500 million for your school system over 20 years, and especially if I was a community with not a super great property tax base, yeah, that's a really hard bell to unring, right? Like when I come up here and I'm talking about water stuff that they've never heard of or they've never thought about, I kind of can't blame them. So again, back to kind of what you can do ahead of time is just talk about these issues, talk about the impacts, and talk about, hey, sure, maybe we got a big dollar amount on this side, but don't forget these other things. And I think that's something that people have done a really, really good job just over the past year across the country, across our state, really emphasizing it's like, this is not just about benefits, we also have to think about the costs, again, not just to the environment, but all of the potential impacts that these facilities will have in those communities, as well as the technology itself. I'm like 10 minutes past when I wanted to end, but I thank all of y'all for your great questions. I thank all of y'all for coming out. Thank Empowering Women's Causes for hosting, and thank HEC as well. So if you've got any questions, again, I will put my email up here briefly. It's just cmiller@alabamaRivers.org. And as we mentioned, we are Alabama Rivers across all socials. If you go to our website, you can sign up for our email list. We really don't send that many, but you can keep up to date with stuff that's going on about data centers and other environmental and water issues in Alabama. So thank you.